I don't know if you've ever felt like you just didn't belong, not in the dramatic teenage angst kind of way, but in this quiet, steady sense that the world wasn't really made with you in mind. I remember feeling that way as a kid, like I was watching everything from behind glass. Everyone else seemed to know the rules, how to laugh at the right moments, how to care about the things we were told to care about, but I was always somewhere else. Not better, just other. There was this boy I knew, Wilhelm. He wasn't flashy or loud or even particularly interesting by the world's standards. But he had something rare. He noticed things. Not the kind of noticing you do when you want to impress someone. I mean the kind where you look at a moment and feel it completely, like it's whispering a secret just to you. I saw that in him, and I recognized it because I felt it too. Wilhelm grew up in a small, quiet world. His parents were farmers, the kind of people who didn't say much unless they had to. His days were filled with silence, not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, empty kind. The kind that makes you think before you even know what thinking is. That silence shaped him. It carved out a space inside him that words couldn't reach. And into that space, something ancient started to grow. People around him probably thought he was just shy, or maybe a little slow. He didn't engage the way others did. He wasn't interested in small talk or games or chasing what everyone else was chasing. It's not that he couldn't, it's that he saw through it all, even when he was too young to understand what he was seeing. And that made him feel alone, long before he even had the language to call it loneliness. Looking back, I think Wilhelm was always on a different path, not because he chose it, but because he was it. There are some people, I believe, who are born carrying questions that others don't even think to ask. Questions like, what does it mean to be real? Why does connection feel so far away? Is there more to life than just going through the motions? These questions don't shout, they hum, like a low current under everything. And Wilhelm lived with that current. Sometimes people like him are mistaken for cold or detached, but that couldn't be further from the truth. There's a depth of emotion in that kind of person, so much that the world can feel overwhelming. So you learn to stay quiet, to pull back, to observe instead of participate. Not because you want to, but because that's the only way to breathe. It's strange how the world doesn't have much room for those who don't play along. There's this unspoken pressure to be normal, to fit, to follow, to smile at the right time. And when you don't, even without meaning to, people don't always respond kindly. They either try to fix you, or they label you, or they simply leave you alone. And sometimes that aloneness becomes a kind of home. Not because it feels good, but because at least there you're not pretending. Wilhelm's quietness wasn't emptiness. It was depth. But the world didn't see that. And I think that's one of the cruelties of being different. Your richness gets mistaken for lack, your reflection for absence. And when no one mirrors back who you are, it's easy to start believing you don't exist in the ways that matter. But even then, even in those early wordless years, there was something forming in him, like a seed buried deep beneath the soil, waiting for something more. He couldn't name it, but it was there. I know because I've felt that too. That sense that there's something in you that doesn't quite belong to the world as it is, but maybe to the world as it could be. Wilhelm didn't talk about it much. Not then, maybe he didn't know how. But he carried it, and I think it carried him too. Through the noise, through the loneliness, through the years when he wondered if there was anyone else who felt like him. And maybe you felt it too. That subtle ache when everyone else seems fine and you're just not. The way you can be surrounded by people and still feel like you're floating somewhere above the room. The way your heart sometimes longs for something you can't even define. If that's you, I want you to know, you're not broken, and you're not alone. Some of us are born with this sense of distance, And maybe that's not a curse. Maybe it's the beginning of something deeper. Maybe it's the first step on a path that leads not away from life, but closer to something real. That was Wilhelm's path, and in a way, it's mine too. It happened suddenly, the way real turning points often do. Not with a grand event or a dramatic decision, but with a single book in a quiet room. Wilhelm was at university, not because he had some grand dream, but because someone told him he should try. He arrived there like most people do, carrying the weight of what he thought he was supposed to be. The son of farmers, a practical man, a future shaped by expectation, not by choice. His life had a script already written. All he had to do was follow it. But then, that book, I don't even remember what it was called. Maybe he didn't either. But it wasn't about the book itself. It was what it did to him. He once told me, with this quiet awe in his voice, that reading it felt like someone had reached inside him and turned on a light he didn't know was there. That moment didn't shout. It didn't demand. It simply was. And in that stillness, everything changed. You know that feeling when something speaks to you so clearly that it silences every doubt you've carried for years. That's what it did for him. It was the first time Wilhelm realized there was a world beyond survival. A world of ideas, of depth, of meaning. A world that called to the part of him he'd always kept hidden. The part that didn't want to be efficient or useful. The part that wanted to feel. From that day on, the path he thought he was on, the one carved by his parents and their parents before them, it just dissolved. He didn't reject it out of anger. He simply couldn't follow it anymore, not after knowing there was something more. So he began to drift, not away from life, but toward himself. He studied literature, not to become a professor or to get a better job, but because the words reached him in a way no person ever had. They gave him permission to feel deeply, to question, to search. The more he read, the more he understood that his solitude wasn't emptiness. It was a doorway, and he started walking through it. But the world doesn't take kindly to those who change their path. People started pulling away. Friends who once shared his space didn't understand why he was always buried in books. His family grew quiet in a different way, the kind that comes with disappointment. Even his wife later on could never reach him. Or maybe she never tried. He didn't blame them. He knew this path wasn't easy to understand, but it still hurt. The more he leaned into his calling, the more disconnected he became from the people around him. There's a loneliness in being true to yourself that no one really talks about, a grief for the life you had to leave behind, even when you know it wasn't yours to live. That's the thing no one prepares you for. When you choose meaning, you often lose comfort. When you choose truth, you lose belonging. At least the kind that's easy, automatic, expected. Wilhelm didn't chase solitude, but it found him the moment he stopped chasing the world's approval. Still, he never turned back. He once said to me, "I'd rather feel alone in truth than connected in a lie." And I believed him, because I'd seen what the other kind of life did to people. The kind where you bury your longings and perform the roles assigned to you. It might look safe, but it's not living. It's disappearing by degrees. Wilhelm didn't want to disappear. He wanted to be, fully, honestly, even if that meant walking alone. Sometimes I think about the courage that takes, not the kind of courage that people celebrate, but the quiet kind, the kind that looks like a man sitting at a desk, reading in silence while the world moves on without him, the kind that lets go of applause in exchange for peace, the kind that chooses the inner path, even when it leads into darkness. And there was darkness. I'll tell you more about that soon. But for now, just remember this. The moment you awaken to something real inside you, the world outside will shift. People might leave. Expectations will crumble. You might even wonder if you've made a mistake. You haven't. The path to yourself isn't paved with approval. It's paved with longing and loss and a quiet kind of joy that no one else can give you because it was yours all along. That's what Wilhelm found, and it changed everything. I think the hardest part about choosing your own path isn't the solitude itself. It's the realization that the further you go, the less you can turn back. That was something Wilhelm started to feel deeply after those early years of study. At first, the books were a refuge, the ideas a lifeline. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, that refuge became the only world he could truly breathe in. By then, he had built a life that looked normal enough from the outside. A job, a marriage, a routine. But it was all just scaffolding around the real journey, the one unfolding silently within him. You could see it in his eyes sometimes. That distant look that wasn't sadness exactly. It was depth, like he was always halfway between this world and another. I remember once watching him at a gathering. People were laughing, talking over each other, chasing the lightness of the moment. And there he was, standing slightly apart, not out of shyness, but because the noise didn't reach him. He was present, but not there. It wasn't loneliness, it was something else, like his soul was quietly watching, asking, is this all there is? Wilhelm didn't despise the world. He just couldn't pretend to need what it offered. Over time, his aloneness became more pronounced. Not because he wanted to push people away, but because connection started to feel impossible. Most conversations felt like theater, rehearsed, surface level, full of unspoken scripts. And when you've tasted truth, it's hard to go back to playing roles. So he stopped trying. And yet he wasn't bitter. That's what I always admired. His solitude wasn't angry or cold. It was quiet, purposeful. There was a dignity to it. He wasn't withdrawing from life. He was descending into himself like a diver sinking deeper and deeper toward the ocean floor, knowing that's where the real treasure was. It was around then that he started telling me about Jung, the idea that solitude was part of a psychological transformation, not a failure but a phase, gave him a kind of grounding. Jung called it individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are by integrating every fragmented part of your psyche, not just the light, polished parts, but the shadowy, rejected ones too. And to do that, you needed distance from noise, from others, sometimes even from yourself. Wilhelm was in the thick of that. He told me once, you can't become yourself while you're still trying to be someone for everyone else. That hit me like a wave. Because isn't that what most of us do? We mold ourselves to fit in, to be liked, to keep the peace. But at what cost? For Wilhelm, the cost became too high, so he chose something else. Or maybe, more truthfully, something else chose him. But the path of individuation isn't glamorous. It's not filled with applause or clarity. It's filled with silence, with staring at the ceiling at night, wondering if the isolation means you're breaking or awakening, with walking through your days feeling invisible and yet more you than ever before. Wilhelm walked that path with grace, but I won't lie, it was painful to watch sometimes. I saw him lose friendships, not in dramatic breakups, but in slow, unspoken drifting. I saw the distance between him and his wife become a chasm neither of them could cross. Not because he didn't care, but because he couldn't fake connection anymore. Not when it wasn't real. And through it all, he kept reading, writing, thinking, reflecting. The outer world may have dimmed around him, but the inner world lit up like a galaxy. I think that's the paradox of this stage. The more inward you go, the more alive you become. But to everyone else, you seem like you're fading. They don't see the richness blooming inside you. They only see the silence. But that silence is sacred. It's where the false self falls away. It's where you stop reaching and start remembering. It's where you realize that nothing outside you can define you. And in that realization, you touch something holy. Wilhelm never spoke about it like that. He wasn't dramatic, but you could feel it in him. A kind of quiet freedom, a slow unraveling of everything he was told to be. And underneath it all, someone new was emerging. Not new exactly, but uncovered, real, whole. If you've ever walked through that kind of solitude, you know what I'm talking about. It's not depression, it's not avoidance. It's a deep, soul-level reckoning, and it doesn't come with instructions. But when you're in it, you start to see the world differently. Not through bitterness, but through clarity. That's where Wilhelm was. And that's where I've been too. If you're there now, just know you're not lost. You're becoming. It may feel like you're disappearing, but really, you're shedding. The noise is falling away. And underneath it all, your true voice is waiting. Keep going. There's a moment in solitude when things shift, when the quiet stops feeling peaceful and starts becoming something else. That's when the shadow shows up. Not as a ghost, but as you, the version of you that you buried long ago. I remember Wilhelm telling me about it like it was a storm that rolled in without warning. He'd been living quietly for years, reading, reflecting, moving through life like a ghost with a pulse. But one night, it changed. The silence turned inward, and what he found waiting wasn't serenity. It was everything he'd tried not to feel: pain, rage, regret, a dull, aching grief for things he never allowed himself to want. He said it felt like the walls of his mind had fallen down, and behind them was a voice he couldn't ignore anymore. A voice that didn't ask politely, it accused, it mourned, it demanded to be heard. That was the shadow. Carl Jung talked about it often, how the parts of ourselves we repress don't just disappear, they fester, they grow stronger in the dark. And one day, they return, not to destroy us, but to be integrated. But integration doesn't start with understanding. It starts with confrontation. Wilhelm met himself in that space, not the self he showed to students or colleagues, not the self who said, "I'm fine," when asked how he was, but the real one, the one that had been left behind in childhood, the angry boy who wanted to scream at the world for being so cold, the lonely man who longed for a partner who truly saw him, the human being who didn't just want truth, he wanted to be held in it. And that's the terrifying beauty of shadow work. It strips you bare. You realize how much you've lied, not to others but to yourself. You see how often you've smiled when you were breaking, nodded when you wanted to run, agreed when your whole being whispered no. Wilhelm didn't run from those realizations. He sat with them, sometimes for hours, just sitting, breathing, letting the pain come, not analyzing it, just allowing it to be. He told me that in those moments he felt like he was dying and being born at the same time. He cried, a lot. Not because he was weak, but because his heart had been locked up for so long that when it finally opened, everything poured out at once. It wasn't just sorrow. It was love, too. Love for himself, for the boy he used to be, for the man he was becoming. And I think that's something most people never do. We all carry shadows. We all have things we'd rather not face, mistakes, memories, desires we've labeled as shameful. But instead of turning toward them, we distract ourselves. We numb. We scroll. We work. We talk over the silence. Wilhelm chose differently. He chose to listen, and in doing so, he began to change. Not in some grand, cinematic way, but in quiet ways. He forgave more, spoke less, let go of things that no longer resonated. He stopped trying to be understood, and strangely, that made him more seen than ever. Because something happens when you own your shadow. You stop performing, and that authenticity, raw, imperfect, human, it's magnetic, not to everyone, but to the people who matter. I won't pretend it was easy for him. There were nights when he doubted everything, days when he felt like he was falling apart, and honestly, some of those cracks never fully healed. But what emerged from the breaking was something rare, wholeness, not perfection, not enlightenment, just wholeness, the kind that comes from holding both your light and your dark in the same breath and saying, "This too is me." I think we all have to reach that point at some stage, the place where the noise of the world fades and all we're left with is ourselves. The question isn't whether the shadow will come, it's whether we'll face it when it does. And if you're in that space now, if you're feeling that heaviness creeping in, if you're afraid of what you might find in the quiet, I want you to know, you're strong enough. You were made for this. The shadow isn't there to destroy you. It's there to reveal you. That's what Wilhelm taught me. That's what life keeps teaching me. You're not broken. You're unfolding. There's a razor-thin edge between depth and drowning, and Wilhelm walked it for years. After he faced his shadow, something in him shifted. He became more still, more self-contained. But there was a point where even I couldn't tell if he was evolving or vanishing. That's the thing people don't talk about enough. When you go deep inside yourself, there's no map, no sign that says, "You've gone far enough. Now come back. You can lose your way." And Wilhelm almost did. He started pulling away even more, not just from people, but from the world itself. He stopped returning calls, rarely left the house unless he had to. Conversations became too exhausting, even with those he once trusted. He wasn't angry. He wasn't bitter. He was just somewhere else, like he was orbiting reality, not living in it. At first, I thought this was part of the process, the necessary silence after the storm of shadow work. But over time, that silence became eerie. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was hollow, like something essential had slipped through his fingers, and he wasn't sure how to get it back. It reminded me of something Jung once said, that self-reflection, if not grounded, can turn into a loop. You keep digging, hoping to find answers, but instead, you just get further from the surface, and eventually you forget what you were looking for in the first place. Wilhelm had always found refuge in literature, but even that began to feel different. The words no longer lit him up the way they once did. He'd read entire passages and look up with blank eyes as if nothing had landed. He was still there physically, but the light behind his thoughts had dimmed. It scared me. He told me once, in a rare moment of vulnerability, "I don't know if I'm still growing or just disappearing." That sentence sat heavy between us, because there is a point where introspection can become a prison, where solitude turns into isolation, where seeking meaning turns into avoiding life. And the worst part? It feels almost noble, like you're doing deep work, but really you're just hiding in plain sight. That's the trap Wilhelm fell into. But here's what saved him: a single, simple thread, his connection to literature. Even at his lowest, he still held on to it. Barely, but it was there. Not because it entertained him, but because it reminded him there was something human left in him, something real, something that still reached for connection, even in the dark. He began writing again, not for publication, not for praise, just for himself. Journals, notes, scraps of thoughts. Some of it made no sense. Some of it was raw and painful. But it was his voice, and it became his rope out of the pit. I learned something watching him crawl back. Even when you're submerged in yourself, even when the world feels like a distant planet, a single act of expression can ground you. It doesn't need to be big, just true. For Wilhelm, that small act of returning to the page was a signal to the universe. I'm still here. It reminded me how fragile the line is between a deep soul and a lost one. The difference isn't strength, it's anchor. The people who survive the inward journey have something that ties them back to the world. Art, nature, a friend, a purpose. The ones who don't, they drift too far. Wilhelm came close, but he found his way back. Slowly, gently, with no dramatic turnaround, no overnight recovery, just a quiet recommitment to stay in touch with what kept him sane. If you've ever been there, if you're there now, I want you to ask yourself, what is my anchor? What reminds you that you exist? What brings you back when the silence gets too loud? It doesn't have to be profound. It just has to be yours. Wilhelm's story taught me that self-awareness is not the goal, it's the beginning. The real challenge is to come back from the depths, still holding your truth, and live. Not perfectly, just honestly. So if you're diving deep, do it bravely. But leave a trail, leave a thread, and don't be ashamed to reach for it when the darkness lingers too long. Because knowing yourself is powerful. But coming back with that knowledge, that's where freedom begins. Something began to shift in Wilhelm. It didn't happen all at once. There was no dramatic realization, no epiphany written in the sky. It was more like a soft thaw, the kind that happens at the end of a long winter, so slow you almost don't notice it until one day you realize the ice is gone. He started showing up again, not loudly, not all at once, but I remember the first time he accepted an invitation to coffee, after years of politely declining everything. We sat in silence for most of it, and that silence felt comfortable, not heavy. Then, out of nowhere, he looked up and said, "I think I can come back now." I didn't ask him to explain. I didn't need to. Something in him had turned outward again. And that's the part of the journey most people forget. The return. Jung called it the archetype of the hero's return, the final step in individuation. After the descent, after facing the shadow, after integrating the broken pieces, the task is not to stay in the cave. The task is to bring what you found back to the world. But this is harder than it sounds, because when you've changed that deeply, the world looks unfamiliar. It feels loud and artificial, and worse, you feel like a stranger inside your own skin. Wilhelm struggled with that. He told me he didn't know how to have small talk anymore, didn't know how to care about the weather or weekend plans. Everything felt either too shallow or too precious to explain. But he tried anyway, slowly, gently, and not with everyone, just with a few people who met him where he was. He no longer chased connection, he curated it. That was one of the most beautiful changes I saw in him. He stopped pretending to be someone he wasn't just to be accepted. He started choosing the spaces and people that resonated with who he had become. There was a stillness in him now, not the kind that comes from withdrawal, but the kind that comes from knowing, from no longer needing to prove or perform. He could sit in a room and say nothing and still make you feel like you were seen. And that, to me, is what coming back looks like. Not flashy, not performative, just honest presence. Showing up as you are without shrinking or swelling to fit anyone's expectations. Wilhelm wasn't trying to belong anymore. He was trying to offer, to bring something back from his journey. Not advice, not answers, just a way of being that said, "I've gone deep and I've survived, and you can too." That's the quiet gift of those who return. They don't come back to fix the world. They come back to live in it more truthfully. And in doing so, they light a path for others. I started noticing how he listened differently. He didn't jump to respond. He didn't try to fix people's pain. He just held space. Sometimes that's all we really need. Someone who's not afraid of the dark because they've sat in their own. That's who Wilhelm became. And the best part? He didn't see himself as special. He never acted like a guru or a sage. If anything, he became more humble, more quiet. He understood how fragile the human psyche is, how easy it is to lose yourself, how sacred it is to find your way back. He once told me, "I don't want to teach. I just want to be real." And he was. It made me think of how many people are walking this same path in secret, going inward, unraveling, rebuilding, and how few are told that the journey isn't complete until they come home to the world again, until they let others see who they've become. So if you're deep in your own process right now, I want to say this clearly. Don't forget to come back, not to the noise, not to the illusions, but to life, to presence, to connection that honors who you are now. You're not meant to stay hidden forever. You've gone far, maybe further than most ever will, and that's beautiful. But don't let your transformation stay locked inside you. Come back. We need people like you in the world. Freedom isn't always what we imagine. You think it's going to feel like joy, like soaring, like the final scene in a movie where everything clicks into place. But when it finally comes, real psychological freedom, it feels quieter than that, softer, almost solemn. That's what I saw in Wilhelm. He wasn't seeking approval anymore, not in conversation, not in work, not even in his inner world. The need to be understood, to be validated, it had burned away in the fire of his solitude. What remained was something still and strong. Self-possession. He didn't need the world to see him clearly, because he had finally seen himself. But here's the part no one tells you. That kind of freedom changes you in ways that make returning to unconscious life impossible. You can't unsee what you've seen. You can't go back to fitting in. You can't laugh at things that aren't funny, or care about things that don't matter. It's not arrogance, it's just alignment. That's the cost of becoming whole. You lose your ability to be fake. Wilhelm accepted that. He lived a quiet life, still preferred solitude, still spoke with that slow, deliberate pace that made you lean in. But there was light in him now, not the light of someone who had all the answers, the light of someone who had stopped running. He told me once, freedom isn't about doing whatever you want. It's about not needing to be anyone else. And I think that's it. That's the gift waiting at the end of the long, inward road. The right to be yourself, without apology. But that freedom has a weight to it. You see more. You feel more. You understand why people avoid themselves. Because facing the truth is terrifying. And yet, you can't help but love them anyway, even when they don't get you, even when they think you're strange or distant, because you remember what it was like to live behind the mask. Wilhelm never became loud about what he had learned. He wasn't the type to write a memoir or host a podcast, but his presence changed rooms. He didn't have to say much. People just felt it, that deep okayness, that unshakable rootedness. It made them slow down, breathe deeper, question the noise. He didn't lead with answers. He led with being. And that, I think, is what the world needs most. Not more noise, not more polished personas, but people who face themselves and come back intact. People who can hold space for others without trying to fix them. People who are free, and in their freedom, remind the rest of us what's possible. But not everyone makes it to that place. Some get lost in the spiral. Some never confront the shadow. Some turn back at the first sign of pain. And I don't blame them. This path isn't easy. It's not glamorous. It's not even linear. You'll get lost. You'll doubt. You'll fall. But if you keep going, if you keep becoming, you'll find something rare. A life that's yours. Wilhelm found it, not because he was smarter or stronger, but because he didn't stop. He walked through the desert, faced the mirror, sat with the silence, and when it was time, he came back. Not as a new person, but as himself. Finally, fully, freely, and if you've come this far, if something in you resonates, maybe you're walking that same road. Maybe you're further along than you think. Maybe you're not lost at all. You're waking up,